The average woman around the globe is going to have fewer children than she desires. The economic future of a country and a lot of just its political problems that it'll encounter, that's very much going to be shaped, not to mention individual costs of loneliness and things like that we've seen from people who don't hit their fertility goals. That flexibility allows people more choice in the labor market. In all of these areas, we trust parents. Why don't we do this right in the political arena as well?
Hello and welcome to the Institute of Economic Affairs. I'm Daniel Freeman, Managing Editor here at the IEA. Today we'll be discussing an IEA report that has just been released. Its title is Mind the Fertility Gap, Why People Stopped Having Babies and How Economic Freedom Can Help. There is a link to that in the description. To discuss this report, I'm delighted to be joined by the report's author, Dr. Clara Piano. Clara is a visiting assistant professor of economics at the University of Mississippi. She earned her PhD in economics at George Mason University, where her dissertation supervisor was Peter Bürtke. So, Clara, thank you so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah. So, I suppose the first question is, what is the fertility gap?
It's a good question because it's a rather new, at least new to economics, fertility statistic. Demographers have been measuring it for many years, but economists are very slow to accept survey data as something that we should be paying attention to because we're usually just looking at how people behave and thinking about revealed preference and not about what they say they value or what they think. But that's definitely become a more important component of economic data in a lot of different areas, employment or inflation expectations or other examples. So the fertility gap is going to look at kind of a preferences adjusted measure of fertility outcomes. So the way it's calculated is very simple. We take some individual respondent, usually it's a reproductive age woman, and we ask how many children would you like to have? Do you plan to have maybe, or do you desire to have? So there's a variety of questions, but some measure of what's your desired fertility. And then we'll take that and we'll subtract off what we either expect her to have or at the end of her reproductive age. So there's also cohort measures, how many children she ends up having, right? So you could maybe ask a woman that question. This would be the strongest measure. Ask someone that question when they're 24 and then follow up when they're 44 about how many children then they actually have. And what is consistently found in most countries around the world, in most places, I've looked at even the individual United States, like the US states, and the UK is no exception. Women are undershooting their stated fertility goals. So they'll say in the UK, it's roughly 2, maybe a little bit above 2 children per woman on average. And fertility actually just hit its lowest recorded point at 1.44 children per woman on average in England and Wales. So that's quite a large fertility gap. That's kind of for every 2 children born, there is another child that was desired that we don't see. And so I think that this is an important measure of fertility because fertility is a really individual choice. And there is a lot of emphasis on replacement rates and declining fertility. But I think a key question to ask as economists, especially as academics, is this just reflective of changing preferences, right? Because there is a story that we could tell where really people, just don't value children as much as they did in the past, and they're not pursuing that as a goal. But when we ask those people themselves, they say that they do. And so that's a big puzzle for us, right? Is what's going on here if people are acting, rationally trying to pursue their goals? What sorts of barriers are presenting themselves and preventing individuals from achieving their fertility goals?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. So the idea is when you ask people, they say they want to have significantly more children than they want. And this is true across the developed world, pretty much.
Even even the less developed world, there's very few. So it's a very interesting measure because there are a few countries in sub-Saharan Africa where fertility gaps are, we would say, negative, meaning that women are exceeding what they say is they think their
Mm.
personal desired number of children. They tend to have more at the end of their reproductive careers. But in the vast majority of countries, and actually one of my frequent co-authors, Lyman Stone, has calculated a global fertility gap because there are global surveys of these both measures. And he's found that actually now there's a positive global fertility gap. So the average woman around the globe is going to have fewer children than she desires.
Mm. One response you sometimes get, sort of slightly more critical of the idea of fertility gaps, is that maybe this is all just social desirability bias. So I'm sure if you ask people, how much do you think you should go to the gym, for example, you would probably get a higher number than the amount of time people actually go to the gym. Is this not just the same case here? People say, oh, I probably should have 3 children or whatever, but they don't actually prioritize it.
That's a great question, because I think that it's a very healthy skepticism that a lot of policymakers or economists will have about fertility preference data. And so I usually point out a couple things. The first thing is that we do find people who state higher fertility preferences to have higher fertility than those who state lower fertility preferences, meaning that, to use your gym example, even if I'm not exactly hitting the mark, it's telling me something about those individuals that they say, I want to go 5 days a week. They're more likely to go 4 than someone who says, well, I really just want to go 1 day a week, right? They're probably not going to go at all. And so it's really helpful actually at the individual level. It's a very robust predictor of fertility, which is powerful because we don't have a ton of those types of measures that are able to connect those dots for us. So it's helpful to see that. And then the second thing is that we really care about these types of outcomes and whether or not, like fertility, for instance, is a little bit different than people going to the gym in the sense that a lot is riding on these individual decisions. So the economic progress of the nation might be influenced by how many people are fulfilling their gym obligations or dreams, but not by very much. However, the economic future of a country and a lot of just its political problems that it'll encounter, that's very much going to be shaped, not to mention individual costs of loneliness and things like that that we've seen from people who don't hit their fertility goals. So that's one thing I think to take into account. And another analogy I like to draw is with employment surveys. So when we ask if someone, or when we think about if there's unemployment in the economy, we don't just count the number of people who do not have jobs, because there are many reasons, good reasons, why people don't have jobs. And similarly, I think there are many reasons why people might not have children, right? And so we don't want to look at those raw numbers, but we ask people about employment, would you like a job, right? And then we count them as unemployed. So I think we should do something similar for fertility. And then lastly, on the social desirability bias, it's not very clear to me that there's a big kind of social force pushing people towards having children. I think that's definitely more maybe defensible in the past when there was a lot of pressure maybe from family members. And I'm not saying that doesn't exist today, but I think it's much less from media, from culture. When you have a culture where people are having children, if you think about like the baby boom era, they're having children very young, they're getting married very young. There might be some pressure because your friends are doing it, but the chances that you're in your 20s today and your friends are doing that, are starting their families and having children, are much lower. So if anything, maybe it's working against that to some extent.
Yeah. Okay, that's a really interesting point as well. And I really want to pick up on the first point you made about people's fertility decisions having broader economic impact. So, as you mentioned at the start of this video, in Britain, the average woman, the average couple have about 1.4 children over the course of their lifetime. Obviously, that's an average. Not many people are having 4/10 of a baby, but thankfully. But what are some of the economic consequences of really, really low fertility rates in the long run?
Mm-hmm. No, this is a really good question, and it's somewhat answered by the increasing number of countries who are really paying attention to declining fertility and kind of scrambling for different options. So, in the short run, um, you actually might see a little bit of an economic boost, by which I mean you're going to have more people engaged in the labor force and fewer people engaged in what we call home production. So generally, you might have a little bit more innovation if you still have a young population, and they're not, maybe this is a very negative way to put it, but they're not, sort of spending sleepless nights with the children. They're well rested and able to go to work and are producing to a high extent. And we actually find some interesting kind of evidence of this. A lot of dictatorships will kind of curb fertility in the short run because it gives them a little boost. But the problem is the long run. And by long run, I don't mean very long, right? So 10 years, 15 years, definitely 20 years. You're going to see, first of all, less innovation. You're going to see smaller. So right now in the United States, we have a smaller high school class every year, which means fewer young people who tend to be the ones who are innovating, taking risks, and having ideas, which fuels economic growth. So people are central to economic growth, not only through their labor, right? You'll have a smaller labor force eventually, but also because of their ideas. And then that will cause problems. If you have less dynamism, less innovation, you'll have lower returns, even in financial markets. And then eventually you'll have lower tax revenues because economic growth will be stunted. So everyone's going to have to tighten their belt eventually. And we also will have what's called an increased age dependency ratio. So there'll be kind of more, and China's really going through this right now because of their one-child policy, right? There's 4 grandparents to support for every working age adult. In the UK, it's not as severe, but it's definitely trending that way if you look at the population pyramids. So those are the economic consequences. It really has ripple effects because I want us to think, again, it's like employment, right? It's really one of those core parts of an economy is how many people do you have, right? How far you can divide labor, how much specialization you can have, how many ideas you have. And so it's looking pretty dire for a lot of countries. And it also increases the pressure on countries politically to either cut welfare benefits, cut spending in some ways, and or increase immigration. So lots of tensions across the board. And then I can just speak maybe a little bit on the individual kind of cost side. Because I do think, we care about, will this have significant effects maybe for mental health or for other sorts of outcomes? And there is a growing body of research that suggests that that is true. It definitely will not help what's called like the loneliness crisis and the fact that a lot of people then will have fewer family members that they go throughout their life with.
Yeah. I think one of the really interesting examples you bring up in the report is Japan, where you got quite an early demographic transition towards people having fewer children. And even though productivity per worker has actually been pretty good in terms of its growth in Japan, because there's such a relatively large elderly population, the GDP per capita benefits of that have been pretty lackluster, as so much has to sort of go to pensioners, basically.
That's exactly right. So it's an elegant paper, as you say, that shows basically a lot of the difference between GDP growth across countries. You can think of Japan. I think a lot of European countries are compared in this paper. And then the United States, which actually has a relatively large working age population and relatively high fertility rate, although not very high. And productivity in Japan has been very high per worker. So that's not the problem. It's just that they don't have many workers.
Mm.
And so you can start to see actually at the macro level, these fertility declines have very real consequences for living standards, which are associated with a lot of good
Yeah.
things, right? Education, healthcare, living a long, fulfilling life.
Yeah. And as you mentioned, also put strain on the fiscal situation as well if you're having a large sort of elderly population that isn't working so much. Um, one of the responses you often get to this is a kind of fatalism that basically says, oh, well, declining birth rates or even a widening fertility gap is just kind of an inevitable consequence of increasing prosperity. But one of the lines you have in the paper is that now in developed countries, children are a normal good. What do you mean by that?
Yes, so this is actually an old debate in economics. We classify goods based on their relationship to income. So whether or not if we see people demand more of these goods when their income rises. And there are several papers and lots of different ways to show this evidence, but it's pretty well understood at this point. I don't think it was this is a relatively new discovery, maybe in the last 20 years that children are a normal good, meaning when someone's income increases, when someone's wealth increases in a sustainable, in like an actual way. And I'm going to kind of go into what I mean by that in a second. Then they tend to have more children. They tend to demand more children. And so one of the papers looks at in the United States at the Appalachian kind of coal boom, and lots of towns experience these hard, and fracking is another example more recently when a lot of towns in the Dakotas experience this large economic growth just because of technological change, fertility rises, and it rises quite substantially. Um, and then another way to look at this is actually to look at in the subset of developed countries, the most developed countries have higher fertility rates than the less developed countries within that group. And so it's pretty well established at this point that it's not simply increasing prosperity or increasing wealth that would cause lower fertility. Children are not an inferior good, which would be the other category of goods. Rather,
An
instead,
inferior good where as you
where
get poorer, you consume more of it. If
that's
consume is
right,
probably
that's
the
right.
wrong word for children, but if you
No, that's
get
right.
what I
Yeah.
mean.
And of course, didn't want to say that children were an inferior good. But it looked like that for a short historical period, actually, most recently in the like kind of past 50 years, before really the 2000s, mainly because economic prosperity was driven in these specific countries by women entering the workforce and especially mothers entering the workforce. And then you don't have what just we call income effects. You would have a substitution effect, meaning that, well, women now just don't have as much time to spend on having children. So an additional thing has changed. Now, on that point, though, something weird has been happening with labor markets recently, where in the last, again, 15 years, fertility in countries is positively correlated to women's labor force participation rates. No one saw this coming. I shouldn't say no one, but not a lot of people saw this coming. And this suggests that there are certain countries that have institutions that allow people to better achieve their goals, whether or not they're career or family related. And there are some countries that have institutions, we can think of labor markets, rule of law, protection of private property rights, et cetera, that are less apt to let or less fit to let young people achieve their goals, again,
Mm.
in career or family fields.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and I think now in line with that, we've also seen the phenomenon of countries that remain, um, relatively poor that have fallen below sort of replacement levels in terms of fertility. So I think you mentioned India, for example, um, um, and yeah, on this point though, if children are a normal good, um, is it possible to simply pay people to have more of them?
That's a great question. And that's one of the reasons we try to be very careful by what we mean by income, right? In economics, right? That's like a promotion at work, right? You're expecting this income, right, for the long run. And all of your future promotions, all of your future earnings are pegged on that. Um, whereas subsidizing childbearing, which is kind of what maybe a lot of people who suggest we should pay people for having children, they're thinking about, right, the public sector doing that, not necessarily like private companies. Um, and so that's a little bit of a different story, right? Because that's not kind of saying this is like a long-term income shock. This is usually in the form of baby bonuses, so like a one-time check, child allowances, so maybe throughout their childhood, or child tax credits, which is the same thing. And so I want to preface this by saying it is true that when you devote more resources to the production of an economic good, which we can think about children, right? Children, of course, are people. I have three of them. I'm not just trying to be very crude here, but I am saying we can at least think of them as economic goods, as things that people pursue in their lives and tend to sacrifice a lot for. And if you devote more resources towards the production of children, you will get more children. The question is, what is the cost benefit ratio essentially? So what we tend to see in those types of policies is that there's a lot of it's very expensive to pay people to have children, that in a way that is meaningful. And it gets more expensive with the wealthier that the country is, right? So in the United States, if you paid us $100 extra, right, for every birth, that's a drop in the bucket for a lot of families, whereas that might be a big incentive, right, in other places. But it's very costly because still a lot of people do have fertility. So that's one thing to consider. And that cost is not just neutral with regard to fertility rates, because it actually means that either the parents are going to have to pay for the cost of that policy or the future generation. So we have to think about those effects as well. And then the second thing is that it's very hard to get to a policy that has a large enough incentive that would change behavior in some way, because just the cost of raising children in the full sense of the term, meaning the opportunity cost, all of that next best alternative life that people have without children, that's a very high cost in real ways, right? In real income and time sacrificed. And so it's hard to actually make a dent in that anyway. Moreover, and I make this point I'm making this point right now actually for an article, it could increase the demand for child complements like housing and actually exacerbate some problems, right? Push demand out in those sectors because now people have more money to spend. Now they want more housing, but the housing market.
So you essentially get massive demand pull inflation in those areas like childcare, for example.
Exactly.
If you give so I this is a really interesting point actually, because I talked to Lyman Stone, who you obviously have written several pieces with, and I asked him sort of what is the cost in terms of as far as you can work out in terms of state subsidy to get a single additional child, and his estimate was somewhere between, in the US, somewhere between $200,000 and $400,000, in addition to any support that currently exists. And so, okay, even if you did have a situation where you were able to give every single parent hundreds of thousands of dollars when they have a child, that's probably going to lead to some really expensive daycare, some really expensive housing in suburbs.
Exactly. Yes. No, I'm familiar with that estimate by Lyman, and it's good and it's important. And he, I think, does very honest work. But you always have to think about these unintended consequences, which we can't hold demand constant in other markets, right? Now, if I have that income shock, right, it's just maybe a one-time payment or whatever. I'm going to demand. I'm probably going to want a nicer house, or I definitely want, some more childcare, diapers, right? All of those things, formula, whatever. All of those markets will be affected. Now, in the long run, we would expect supply to adjust maybe, and so then lower the prices again. But the key thing is in those markets like housing and childcare, it's very regulated. And so
Mm,
supply is not as able to respond rapidly to increases in demand.
yeah.
And we already see this especially with housing, right? It's very rising housing prices are indicative of basically supply not being able to keep up with demand. And so that's really the main concern is that if we had very flexible markets, you would see actually that shift in demand cause more production, but we wouldn't expect to see that in those markets because of regulation.
Yeah. And this is a really good point, because this is what your paper focuses on. It's the supply side measures, the economic sort of freedom that can actually help people have the number of children they want without spending literally trillions of pounds on it. So what sort of things seem to have an impact on reducing this fertility gap when it comes to the supply side?
Hmm. Yeah. So the first and I think one of the biggest things is that I kind of take for granted the fact that young people want to pursue both careers and families today. And that's borne out by a lot of different research. And so I think we take that as a starting place. And then we ask, what are barriers to work family compatibility? And it turns out, and I've just looked at this in the United States so far, but it'd be wonderful to expand this. But it turns out that labor market freedom, meaning a state that has fewer occupations where you need significant licensing and high barriers to entry in those places, fewer just regulations on hiring and firing, for instance, fewer bans on like remote work or some of their gig work, right? All of these types of things. Just the more flexibility and choice you give to young people in their labor market choices, actually, they tend to have more children and reaching their fertility goals at a better rate. And so we find, just to kind of briefly summarize, that economic freedom in the individual United States, especially in labor market freedom, is positively associated with smaller fertility gaps, which means more women, more couples achieving those fertility goals. And so we think that that's really important. Now, of course, one of these aspects of economic freedom we don't focus as much on this paper. There's other work that looks at this already, is housing regulation and land use regulation, because children or houses can be thought of as a child complement, meaning that people tend to want either home ownership or just some sort of space with a lot of bedrooms when they have more children. The reasons I think are really obvious if you've been around children, right? They thrive with space and they're noisy, all of this kind of thing. And so if you have more regulation on the uses of land, on housing, which really just you want to think about creating, it really kind of locks down this market, makes it very rigid, makes it very unresponsive to demand, including the demand of young people, young parents. And so there is work that shows that more regulation is associated with lower fertility as
Mm,
well. And then we have a working paper that looks at childcare markets, because those are also very regulated in ways that are understandable, right? So people really, we care about quality when it comes to childcare, especially. However, it looks like the regulations are not necessarily increasing quality, but they do increase costs, which then can
mm.
again have that unintended consequence of lower fertility.
Yeah, these were all really interesting points, and it's so good this in the United States, because you have um different regimes in different states. You're very able to sort of compare and contrast the different effects. Um, yeah, I'm particularly interested in this point on housing, actually, because obviously in Britain this is even bigger, even more of an issue, I think, than in much of the United States. Um, is there a particular sort of um measure of the kind of is there any particular type of housing that has a bigger impact on fertility choices than others, or is it just housing per se?
So this is really interesting. This is really kind of the cutting edge of the research right now is investigating this question. And I'd say I'll give my own approach and then I'll give some other work. Or I'll give some other work first and then I'll follow with what my own interpretation. Survey data shows that it's really a matter of bedrooms. And this is, again, kind of work with Lyman that he's done with other co-authors, that really it's not about renting versus owning, but just the fact that apartments aren't likely to have many bedrooms. That's really kind of this clamp down on fertility, right? It's just very hard. I know I actually was looking for apartments when I had my first two children, and it's very hard to find a 3-bedroom apartment.
Mm.
And so that's one consideration. And so that work seems to suggest that there's nothing inherent about ownership or renting or city versus, rural. It's just about the number of bedrooms, which is then correlated with or negatively correlated with urban apartment life, right?
Mm.
However, there's work that I find really compelling about marriage and home ownership.
Mm.
And the idea is that owning a home acts as collateral in a marriage and sort of that marriage contract, if we want to think about it like a contract, where it makes the marriage more valuable than otherwise would be. Because now if you want to break it up, you have to then sell that house. You have to let go of that place. It's not as easy. That transaction cost is so much larger than just renting, right? Changing kind of like to a new apartment or a new home. And so I do think that I would take kind of like recent survey data with a grain of salt, because I think that there is quite a strong demonstrated relationship between home ownership and marriage rates, at least again in the United States, and it's probably true in the UK. You are so much more likely to be married if you own a home. In fact, the marriage rates are very stable for homeowners, where for every other group, it's just absolutely tanked. And so there's something about maybe the home as an asset that's owned that could be conducive to marriage, which itself is conducive to fertility.
Right. And when people are married, they are more likely to have children,
Much more,
basically.
yes.
Yeah. Um, I mean, that's less true in France, isn't it? Where you do get sort of people having more children out of marriage.
Yeah, so this is something I think about quite carefully, because the real question is not like marriage is in the legal definition per se from the economic perspective. It's is it a long-term agreement between two people, right? Is it very stable?
Hmm.
Or is there a lot of so in the United States, a marriage is, quite stable, but if you're not in a marriage, you're changing partners quite frequently. Whereas in France, it's actually different. It's more of a what we would maybe say common law marriage, where people aren't getting registered as married, but they are very stable. And so there, you would still expect to see those couples acting like, right, they're married.
Yeah, similar effects. Okay, so we've dealt with sort of labor market flexibility seems to be good for fertility rates, and that it allows people back into the labor market more easily after they've had children. Is that basically the mechanism?
I think that there's a lot of ways in which it functions. And so that's one big mechanism, is that maybe I don't want to go back to my full-time work, but if there's a lot of flexibility, I could have that freedom, right, to find part-time work, to find, piecemeal work, whatever works with, an individual family, which everyone is going to be different here, right? And we're not trying to prescribe outcomes for everyone. That flexibility allows people more choice in the labor market. Or it could be that maybe I select into a job as a college graduate that I think is more family friendly, that's compatible with my goals, and I'm more likely to be able to find that option if the labor market is more flexible. So there's that route as well.
Mm, yeah, no, that's really interesting, and I think particularly relevant to the UK, where we have had quite a flexible labor market compared to other European countries over the last sort of 20, 30 years, but it seems to be heading in the other direction. Now, just kind of a final point. Most of your paper is about supply side economic policies that you can do to try and encourage people to have children. But you also have a section on thinking outside the box or thinking creatively. And one of your modest proposals is that we should allow parents to vote on behalf of their children.
Mm-hmm. This
Yeah.
is right.
What's the
Yes.
case for this?
Yeah. So thank you for asking about this because it's an infant idea, but I think it's important to think creatively in this space in a way where we can try to be innovative, right? And get more with less cost, with a lower cost. And so one of these proposals, or just kind of, it's actually an academic law review article in the United States called "Give Parents the Vote." It's not, and Demny voting is another name for this. So it's not unique to me by any stretch of the imagination. However, I think it's worthwhile to consider as maybe like a pro-family, pro-natal policy for the reasons that it's very low cost. It's just kind of a stroke of the pen, right? Versus $200,000 or something like this, or many, many pounds. And it's very intuitive because I think a lot of the political, what we would say maybe dysfunction that we see is caused or has this underlying factor of children not having a lot of political say. Now, right now, obviously, I'm sure parents of children do vote with their interests in mind. However, their vote counts equally, right, to someone who doesn't have dependents.
Hmm.
And so I think it's an elegant solution to this problem to let voting parents, so, right, you'd have to be eligible to vote as a parent, then cast proxy ballots on behalf of their minor children. So the idea here is that you just get to voice, right, your child's concerns in that voting booth, whereas we entrust parents every other aspect of life with their child's, interests, right? For their healthcare, for their education, and all of these areas, we trust parents. Why don't we do this, right, in the political arena as well? And it would be quite significant, I think. And most importantly, it would allow different jurisdictions or different groups to voice what for them are the main barriers, right, to their child's welfare and potentially having additional children. Because for some regions, maybe it really is that housing that's the key barrier. And so parents could vote, right, and make their interests known in that way. But it's going to be different in different regions. And so to allow for that kind of multiplicity of solutions to that same problem, which is hard to capture when you're just doing some sheer, academic research. We're not as smart, right, as individual parents who are seeing these barriers themselves.
Yeah. No, well, it's a very interesting proposal, and it's I suppose it's one way of dealing with the issue that's sometimes claimed that we're turning into gerontocracies due to not just there being lots of older people, but also elderly people, pensioners tending to vote more than younger people, have a higher voter turnout. So yeah, I'm sure people will be arguing about that in the YouTube comments very vigorously. But yeah, I mean, I think that's about all we have time for. But thank you, Clara, so much for coming in. Thank you for writing this paper for us. It's really, really excellent read. Yeah, and if you do want to read this, dear listener, do look in the description where there will be a link to the PDF for Mind the Fertility Gap While People Stopped Having Children and How Economic Freedom Can Help. And yes, do follow that and do remember to like and subscribe and all of that. But until then, I will see you next time.